You're listening to Cover Your Assets, a podcast that discusses the timely and significant legal issues faced by employers. Kathleen Jennings is an attorney who has over 30 years of experience in advising employers as to their legal responsibilities and has written extensively about employment law in her popular Cover Your Assets blog. If your business has employees, you cannot afford not to have your assets covered.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Cover Your Assets, the labor and employment law podcast. And before we begin, I want to thank everyone that has subscribed, that has shared. And as always, it looks like our numbers are going up. And of course, I am here with our resident expert,
Hey, Tom.
AKA attorney Kathleen Jennings. How are you today, Kathleen?
Doing great, Tom. So which of our podcasts is our number one rated podcast? Have you had a look at that?
I have, and usually you look at the ratings over the last 30 days. So this, the one that is actually on the top of the list right now is, they say it's your birthday, which I thought was a great episode. And it
was a great episode.
It finally overtook the workplace romance, which was
another good episode,
which was number one for a while. I think this one's going to be a great episode. And today, which this is our 11th podcast episode, it is also the first with a guest.
A guest? Is it someone that I know, Tom?
It is someone that you know. It's a name familiar to you because it indeed, this person shares a name with not only our father, but with your brother, which is Thomas Jennings. Mr. Thom Jennings, we call you T3. How are you today, sir?
I'm good. I mean, T3 you haven't used too often. Thom Jr. The irony is that a couple people have found your podcast from me sharing it on LinkedIn and have thought it was me. And I have to admit, I've been shamelessly taking credit in a couple circles. So it was only a matter of time before I actually appeared on this thing and stopped pretending I was you.
And in terms of shameless promotion, you know, Kathleen, who is your aunt, also has said, you know what, this guy's got a pretty big following amongst certain types of people. And why don't you just give us a quick introduction as far as we know you're my son and her nephew, but why do we bring you here today, and what is your area of expertise when it comes to labor and employment?
I mean, other than being your son and Kathleen's nephew, I don't think there's anything more important than that in terms of credibility, correct?
Well, that is an awesome answer. You know what, that is why, in addition to having my favorite brother on this podcast, I now have one of my favorite nephews.
Very diplomatic of you. You can tell that you're an attorney. Well, listen, I'm gonna just say it for him. Tom works for a company in Buffalo, New York, and he is the old term that they used to use is headhunter. And I believe the more proper terminology now is executive recruiter. And what's the company that you work for in Buffalo? And maybe just give us a little bit of background on the types of people that you work with on a regular basis.
Yeah, so we still use headhunter. It has some negative connotations. I'm not sure why, but I embrace the term. You'll find it on my LinkedIn. I describe myself as headhunter. Some people call us recruiters. You can throw fancy words at us like talent acquisition specialist, which I think sounds pretty neat. Or my formal title, the one that lands on my business card, is executive recruiter. But yeah, I work for a company now, Selective Staffing Solutions. Specifically, I spearhead their executive search division under the brand name Alberts Executive Search, which is named after Michelle Alberts, who founded the firm about 16 years ago. But I'm a generalist. A lot of folks in the executive recruitment space find a niche. There is, folks out there that specifically they only recruit human resources or they only recruit supply chain or engineering. I touch a little bit of everything. Right now, I'm working on a chief human resource officer search. I'm also working on a director of administrative services search, and a staff accountant, and dozens of others that are really all over the map. So I'm blessed to touch a lot of different fields and talk to a really wide variety of professionals out there.
And really, the reason that we have you on today, because with the theme of the Cover Your Assets podcast, is we talk about companies that could potentially get in legal trouble when it comes to HR issues. And one of the most important, if not the most important function that a human resources professional engages in on a day-to-day basis, other than managing benefits, is interviewing clients. And
applicants. We'll say interviewing applicants, Tom.
Well, in his case, they would
I
be
like
potential
candidates.
Clients. Yeah, candidates.
Candidates.
So in the
human talent.
In the process of trying to acquire human talent and applicants, you obviously there's many laws that you have to respect and have to be very careful, or you could set yourself up for a lawsuit. So I guess in simplest terms, there's questions that you can ask, and there's questions that you cannot ask that will get you into trouble. And I guess we'll start with a few of them that I'll throw at you, and then Kathleen and Thom Jr., you guys can kind of go back and forth in terms of either, how you can carefully broach these things without getting into trouble. Now, the big one I always think of is age. So you don't want to be in a position where you are accused of age discrimination. So I believe I'm correct that you cannot ask a potential employee their age. Is that correct?
What the law really says, there's no law that says you can't ask an applicant their age. But what the law says is that you cannot discriminate on the basis of age. So if you are asking someone for their age, and their age has nothing to do with their ability to perform the job, then that could be evidence that you are looking to discriminate against a certain class of people because of age. So really, when we're talking about what you can and cannot ask, you want to start with basic questions that concern a candidate's ability to do the job. What are the functions of the job? What are the duties of the job? And you want to focus on whether that person you're talking to can or cannot do the job. You don't want to ask questions about things that have nothing to do with the job and that could ask for information that could be considered discriminatory. You don't ask women of childbearing age, when are you planning on having kids? Or are you planning on having kids? You don't ask people their age. You don't ask people where they were born or what country they were from if they have an accent. You can ask people if they are legally able to work in this country, because that's a legal question. So you have to differentiate between what do I need to know in order to determine if this person can do the job, and what kinds of things do I not need to know, because really it just looks like I'm discriminating. And the EEOC on their website, eeoc.gov, has a list of topics and types of questions that you can look to for point of reference for the kinds of things you can and cannot ask. I see Thom Jr. nodding his head. So he, I believe, as someone who probably engages in a lot of interviewing, is familiar with these parameters. What say you, Thom Jr.?
So the funny thing is when I the clients that really get in the most trouble when it comes to age discrimination, it's not so much about the questions they're asking as much as just the statements that are coming out in an interview, right? So, maybe they didn't outright ask, how old are you, right? But they might make a comment. They might say, well, you're a little older than most of the people here. Most of the people in our sales department are, fresh out of college. Those are statements that can come out in an interview that, can be interpreted as age discrimination, and you never even asked a question. My general rule of thumb, and when I onboard a new client, and in the agency recruitment space, I'm playing both sides of the fence. And what that means is I have my clients who are employers, and they hire me to find people for their positions. So those are my candidates. But a lot of times those clients, especially folks, maybe smaller businesses that are newer to interviewing, will ask, what types of questions should I be asking? What are things, and this always comes up, what are some things I shouldn't ask? What are some things I should stay away from? And without overcomplicating it, I kind of joke with them. I say, if you just met somebody in the grocery store for the first time and you think it would be inappropriate to ask that, it's going to apply here. You wouldn't walk up to, if I didn't know you and I ran into you in the grocery store, I sure as heck wouldn't walk up to you and be like, oh, how old are you? Oh, are you pregnant? There's one you would never ask, right? A lot of those things that seem like common sense, you just have to apply them to the interview process. And age is one of them. Like it's you can get into a lot of trouble by addressing something that, frankly, it isn't appropriate to address, nor should it be addressed at any point in an interview setting.
Yeah, I mean, so much of that is, and I guess in an interview situation, a lot of stuff comes out. And I know back when I was a restaurant manager and we would interview potential employees, we would get trained on this kind of stuff. And they would say things along the lines of, you can't ask somebody's age. But if you want to know somebody's age, there's ways of figuring that out. Based on the year that they graduated from school, things like that. And but again, I think those are things that potential employers do, maybe to figure out how old somebody is. I mean, that's the kind of stuff though that can't necessarily get you in trouble, can it, Kathleen? Because if you're not overtly kind of fishing for the age information, how would you prove discrimination?
Well, proving discrimination by an applicant that does not get hired, those are some of the harder cases for those plaintiffs to prove, because they maybe were not hired for a number of factors. Maybe age was part of it, but there were probably other more qualified candidates. So it's going to make it hard for them to prove discrimination. But as a practical matter, you don't want to say anything during an interview that would put a target on your back. Making comments about someone's age, something like, were you at Woodstock? That would give away someone's age. Or making comments that, again, have nothing to do with the job. Now, the problem is in a lot of interviews, or there are no problems, there are only challenges. The challenge you face in a lot of interviews is it's a conversation. So sometimes the candidate, him or herself, may volunteer information that could disclose the fact that they are in a protected category that you didn't otherwise know about. And if that happens, generally, it's probably a good idea to just sort of breeze by it. Don't focus on it. Don't linger on it. Don't make it seem like it's a big deal. But it's going to happen. And so you have to be able to handle it.
Well, let's throw a couple of interesting scenarios that Thom and I have dealt with over the years. And in our the one I remember, you and I worked for an employer that interviewed someone that showed up at the interview as a man and then came to work and identified as a female. Do you remember that scenario?
I do, vividly.
Yeah. And it created quite a stir in the workplace. But I guess, that's got to be now, especially as things are becoming more accepting as far as gender fluidity and things like that. Those situations come up. And I guess the reason I mention that is because on some level, I think she didn't feel comfortable coming to the interview as a female and maybe felt that she had a better chance of getting hired in the position as a male, and then showed up to work as a female. And of course, at that point, now, even if you did have an issue with somebody that was transgender, you obviously aren't going to address that, because that becomes a clear case of discrimination.
Absolutely. Title VII currently does prohibit discrimination against a person on the basis of transgender status, among other issues.
Well, it all comes back to your point earlier, though, that it's all relevant to the duties of the job, correct? So if in that case in point, and I remember that person, I remember the position, you know, this was essentially like a web development type role. In no way would the fact that she was transgender, would that have any effect on her ability to complete the tasks of her role,
Right.
whatsoever.
But it was a comfort issue on her end, because on some level she must have felt that there was potential for discrimination because of the transgender status. That's the only reason I bring it up, because you wonder, again, coming back to if somebody shows up to a job interview and they are transgender, and then you have that thought in your mind, maybe they think that could potentially impact their ability to be employed. And you can use another example. You mentioned before a pregnant woman. Okay, a pregnant woman, somebody shows up to a job interview that appears to be 7 months pregnant. Let's be honest, what employer is going to want to hire them because they know that they're going to have to go on maternity leave in 2 months? So there you go. Could an employee in that situation show up, and I know we talk about the ability to do the job, but somehow hide the fact that they were pregnant in order to get the job for fear of discrimination?
But this is where it all comes full circle in a sense, because now pregnancy is an issue I run into a lot. Now, let's say it's a position in a warehouse, and Kathleen can step in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but it would make complete sense, and I believe it would be well within the interviewer's or employer's right to ask, are you capable of lifting more than 50 pounds?
Right.
And if the answer to that question is no,
that's the type of medical question that cannot be asked unless there is a conditional offer of employment.
ooh.
Well, explain what a conditional offer of employment is, because I think this is, because I think my impression is that something you could ask in the interview, because kind of going back what I said before, when I was a restaurant manager, they would tell us, if you want to get somebody's age or marital status or any of that kind of stuff, there's ways of figuring it out without overtly asking it.
Well, anytime you're looking, I guess if you're just asking if they can lift a certain amount, and that had better be an actual amount that is lifted pursuant to that job. You say this job requires frequent lifting of 20 pounds or more, 30 pounds or more. You can put on the job application. Is that something you can do with or without accommodation? But if it comes down to actually medically determining if a person can't perform those essential functions with or without reasonable accommodation, and I believe we discussed this in our reasonable accommodation episode, those kinds of medical questions or physical capability questions can only come after there is a conditional offer of employment, the offer being conditioned upon verification from a medical doctor or whomever that the person is physically capable of doing the job with or without reasonable accommodation. It's complicated.
So can the employer get into trouble if they don't ask that question, and then it turns out that the employee can't do the job because of a physical restriction?
Well, first you need to identify what are the essential functions of the job. And the question that you can ask any applicant or candidate is, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation? So first, is it an essential function? And this is, again, this is something we can spend a whole podcast episode on. Make sure it's an essential function. Does this person in this job have to do this particular duty? Or is it something that is not done frequently? Or is it required all the time? You need to identify that. And then can the applicant perform the essential function of the job with or without reasonable accommodation? If you ask the pregnant woman, are you able to lift 50 pounds? And she says yes. And then she's going to show up the next day, perhaps with a doctor's note that has some restrictions. That's where you probably want to explore that issue with the conditional offer, as you would for somebody with a disability. You can't make assumptions ever about what someone can or cannot do just by looking at them. So in the case of pregnant women, you can't make assumptions that, oh, we have to treat them as delicate flowers and they can't do anything too strenuous and, all of that. You can't make those assumptions.
Are you able to ask if they have kids? I wondered about that as well.
No. Well, you shouldn't, particularly, and this goes down to women in this country still carry most of the childbearing responsibilities. Now, some people, like, for example, my nephew here is very involved in child caring of his beautiful child, Miss Michelle. But for the most part, a lot of women are still left with most of the child care responsibilities. So if you ask a woman in particular if they have kids, that could be taken as a question that you are concerned that maybe they're going to miss a lot of work because they need to pick up the kids from school or stay home with kids when they're sick or something like that. So that's why you generally don't ask that kind of question in a job interview.
Well, it all kind of comes back to this too. Where does that actually fit in a job interview? What job are you interviewing for? What position do you have at your company that says if you do or do not have kids, you cannot perform this job? Because the reality is where that question becomes malicious. And I've experienced this on a personal level, right? And Dad, you and I have worked at companies like this. These, and it's a little more prevalent in, large like sales organizations, right? Where that question comes up because what they're getting to is they want to know that you don't have a ton of outside responsibility, outside work, right? Are you, to Kathleen's point, are you the person that, is going to have to take some extra sick time? I take a lot of time off because my daughter gets sick, right? That happens to most parents. Are you going to miss days to, make it to your children's events and whatever else? So, when employers are asking those questions in interview settings, the sad reality is a lot of the times it doesn't have the best intent, because I honestly can't think, and, at this point I have recruited hundreds of positions. I can't think of a single position I've ever recruited for where I could say, if you do or do not have kids, that's going to dictate whether or not you're qualified for this role. Not a single one.
Right. But that, like you said, there are employers that fish for that information because they don't want to have to deal with people that are taking a bunch of time off because they have small children. And I think at some levels, employees don't even necessarily want to talk about that stuff. It goes back to, the employee not wanting to let their employer know that they're transgender, an potential employee not wanting people to know that, that they're pregnant. I mean, all that kind of stuff. So you're right. It really comes down to a conversation, and the job interview is, as much as it's an important part of the hiring process, it's only one part of it. But on both sides, it really becomes a chess game. And in the process, you have to be very careful, coming back to the theme of the podcast, which covering your assets. On the employer end, when you're playing that game, you have to be very, very careful which moves you make, either because of malicious intent, which, I've had situations where I had a job interview where somebody said, who carries the health insurance in your family? Because they didn't want to have to pay for my health insurance. I mean, that's clearly an illegal question. But if I need the job, I'm not going to say anything that they asked a question that they shouldn't ask. But if they ask that question to the wrong person, that becomes very sticky. And I wonder in your line of work, especially because in executive recruiting, if I understand the process, they come to you, you're basically prepping them, you're pre-screening. So you're sending a potential employee to an organization. Where do you fall in terms of working with the candidate that you're sending to an employer? And then also, what if you get into a situation where, somebody comes back to you and says, well, in the interview process, they asked me a bunch of questions that they weren't supposed to ask me. I mean, that kind of puts you in a very difficult position all the way around, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it's interesting in my role because I am both client advocate and candidate advocate. I used the term last time that I'm playing both sides of the fence, but it's true. I'm working alongside the candidate. I'm preparing them for the interview, but I might be consulting the client on this at the same time on how to, properly conduct the interview. It's like anything. If things come out of an interview process, and it has happened where a candidate comes to me and they said, hey, they asked me these inappropriate questions, those are things I'm going to have to take up with that client. To be very blunt, it's on a professional level, it's a moment I have to consider if that's even a client I want to work with, right? But, my role is unique in the sense that I'm often a first line interview, but because of my position in the process, I have much more open and candid conversations with those candidates. They'll reveal things to me that they wouldn't be comfortable necessarily revealing in an interview process. People talk, I'm talking to them about their motivations. I'm talking to them about their hopes and dreams. Ultimately, I'm the individual they're talking to that hopefully can unlock a new career to them. So I will get very frank questions. Hey, my wife is pregnant and I'm going to take a paternity leave in 6 months. How do you think I should handle this when I step into the interview? And at the end of the day, my advice always seems to be the same, and I always share this on both sides. Is transparency always wins, right? Transparency always wins, and not to get way off track, but if people find themselves in an interview setting where the questions are uncomfortable, I promise you don't want to work there, and I'm going to be that blunt about it. If those red flags come up in an interview where you feel like, this employer is really prying, they're asking me about medical conditions, or, maybe I'm, LGBTQ and I don't feel like their culture supports that because they're, questioning that, I promise you do not want to work there. It is not a fit. So don't overthink, what should I do about this? How should I feel? At the end of the day, the types of employers that engage in some of this stuff that we're talking about are not employers of choice. They're just not. We're talking about bad business practices. We're talking about the people that open themselves up to EEOC lawsuits. The funny part is how often are we surprised, right? It's never like the company that you're like, oh my gosh, they're so amazing. They have the greatest reputation. That hiring manager, everybody loves him. I find it so odd that he asked inappropriate questions. Yeah. No, we know about these folks. So, when I'm speaking with candidates, I'm speaking with clients, I always say the same thing. Transparency always wins, and interviews are conversational. Things are going to get brought up naturally. That's the other piece of it. Anybody with kids, this, it's impossible not to talk about them. I can't think of any conversation that happens in any of my day-to-day life where it doesn't come up that I'm a parent. Yeah. Because that's my other full-time job. That's probably my first full-time job, actually. Recruiting is probably my second full-time job, right? And it will come up naturally in conversation, but I don't walk into that conversation thinking about how am I going to address this? How am I going to let them know that I have children? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that if the interview itself is, it really sets the foundation for the employment too. If you come out of the interview and then you have a certain set of expectations and then you get into the workplace and those expectations aren't met, then you have a disgruntled employee. And then we go back to, the situations that Kathleen and I talk about on a week-to-week basis. Once you start that ball rolling and you bring in an employee that's disgruntled, then they're going to start looking for things to happen. And like you said, things come up in interviews that may be gray areas legally, but there's no malice that's intended. But if for some reason something, there's an employee that is, I don't know, we lived next door to a guy, for example, who made a living suing restaurants with slips and falls. And I'm sure that there's serial employees that go out there and look for employers that commit violations, and hopefully that they have an opportunity to sue them for discrimination, multiple cases. I mean, have you had a situation like that at all, Kathleen?
There are serial suers, normally not because of something like interview questions. It's going to be something more likely that happens once they get to work. They're going to be, we've come up with, almost one of my partners has come up with a profile of, the most potential, the person most likely to become a plaintiff. And so there are certain characteristics of these people that are going to make folks more likely to sue you than others, such as, someone who never takes responsibility for anything, someone who's just looking for problems. I could go on with that kind of stuff. So one of the things you can do in an interview is try to weed out some of those characteristics. You don't want the person coming to work for you who can't accept responsibility for mistakes. We all make mistakes. You don't want that person who's going to blame everybody else or blame it on, well, I didn't make a mistake. You must be discriminating against me. So those are some of the things, some of the subtle issues that you can try to explore in job interviews. And those would be the kind of issues you could explore when you ask someone about their prior employment history or prior employment situations and how they handled them. That's what you're looking for there. And there's nothing unlawful about looking for those characteristics. Now, you don't want to ask someone, have you ever sued another employer? Because then they may claim maybe there's retaliation. Technically, they're not engaging in any kind of protected activity just by suing prior employers. But you know that if you ask that question, they're thinking, aha, they're gonna be watching me especially carefully. And so I'm gonna watch them even more carefully.
Yeah. Well, we're getting ready to wrap up. I know, is there obviously our guest, this has been a lot of fun, but I think there's some stuff you'd like to still touch on. Is there anything an issue you think that we missed in terms of interviewing from your end, Thom Jr.?
I think the interesting thing is we look at some of these interview questions and laws that are out there, like they're setting up traps. But that's not necessarily the case. Some of these laws exist to protect people on both ends. I think, the greatest example, and something that, my practice is based in New York State, and this is something that changed for us. I don't remember the exact date. I think it was probably 2-3 years ago. COVID has kind of blended some years together. But, one of the laws that came out said that you cannot ask individuals what their current salary is. And it's an interesting thing, because when I first came up in my field, that was very common. I asked that in every interview. And sadly, we did use that as a basis to kind of judge where clients might come in with a job offer. And that is a lot of the rationale behind where that law came into place. Because, the people that orchestrated that legislation, their thought process was, it's kind of irrelevant what somebody's currently getting paid, right? Maybe they're underpaid. We talk about gender pay gaps and all these different things, right? How do we issue some layer of protection for, job candidates to get what they should, what their value is in this marketplace, and not base it on what they were currently earning? Because at the end of the day, there is a layer of discrimination there. If I'm recruiting for a job that pays $100,000 to $150,000, and I ask a candidate, what are you currently making now? And they say, well, I'm making 90. Well, the employer might think, well, everybody's got a budget, right? I'll come in at 100. That's a $10,000 pay increase for them. But that doesn't actually spell out what that candidate's value is or what they're worth to the organization. Would you pay if that candidate came to you and they said, I'm currently making 120, would you pay him 125? So those things come into play to protect some of these candidates. So, the point I guess I just want to make is I think we talk about interview questions and all these things and pregnancy and age, like laws have just set up all these pitfalls that candidates and employers could fall into. And I truly believe that's not the case. I really believe that there was the right intentions behind a lot of these laws, and they protect people on both ends. That ultimately the end goal is having employees in the best possible employment situation.
Yeah. And I think, just to coin an old adage, honesty is always the best policy. And I mean, that's been a recurrent theme in our podcast. Wouldn't you say, Kathleen? I mean, it's the people that get themselves into trouble when it comes to employment situations. I would say 90% of the time it's because there's some dishonesty involved somewhere along the line.
Absolutely. And also in this context, especially with hiring, one of the best reasons not to ask questions that are irrelevant to the performance of the job is because what you don't know can't be used against you.
Yeah.
So don't ask it if you don't want it to be used against you, potentially.
Yeah.
That sounds like some very classic lawyer advice right there. Can you say that?
I am a very classic lawyer.
Absolutely. And of course, one other thing very important to touch on before we wrap this up, but like you mentioned, that law changed a couple of years ago. So it's Kathleen, your firm offers training on laws, and laws are changing. I mean, New York State just came out with an employment law related to notification to employees of any email or phone conversations that are being monitored by the employees. So that's a law. That's exclusive to New York State. But again, federal laws change, state laws change, maybe local laws, whatever. But it's important to be up to date on these laws because you don't want to get yourself into trouble because, like you said, I'm 55 years old. I've been interviewing guys let's just say I've been interviewing people for, 30 years. I'm one of those old school guys, Hey, how much you make there, Kathleen? 120, 130? So, I mean, there's people that may ask those questions because it's the question that you always asked. So you got to make sure that people are trained and that they know not to ask those types of questions that may now be illegal because of laws that are, again, well-intentioned to protect both the employer and the employee. All right. So, Kathleen, I'll go to you. Takeaways from this particular episode?
Well, the takeaway, of course, the classic lawyer logic: don't ask a question that you don't want to be used against you. And as Thom pointed out, it is very important to be up to date on federal, state, and local laws in terms of interview questions, discrimination in the workplace, and the like. And I would also say thank you very much to my nephew, Thom Jr., for being on our podcast this week. You have really added some interesting flavor to the podcast, and we thank you for being here.
Yeah, there's a lot more that we can discuss, so hopefully you'll agree to do this again. I don't know, periodically every few months, but why don't you give us your contact information as far as anybody that might be looking for your services?
I think the best way for folks to find me, and maybe this is like a classic recruiter thing, right? Look me up on LinkedIn. Ironically, I have the same exact name as Thom Jennings Sr. I'm even going to try and imitate his voice, right?
Host.
The podcast co-host, by the way, co-host, Thom Jennings, or it's LinkedIn/in/T Jennings1. Look me up. I post content like this a lot. I'm passionate about these topics. I borrow a lot from the experiences that I've had with my father here. If he hasn't talked about it in previous episodes, even though I know he has, we've worked together on several occasions, which has been a ton of fun. And then, of course, to my takeaways and another one of my great influences is certainly my Aunt Kathleen here. Employment law is one of those areas that recruiters such as myself and HR leaders and everybody else, we brush up on it, right? We know the basics of what we have to, but I can't stress enough, find yourself some good counsel. If you're not fortunate enough to have an aunt who's an employment law expert, go to Google, do something, find somebody, because these can be costly mistakes that you can make in the process, that can be avoided with the right expert in your corner.
Proactivity as well. Kathleen, what's your contact information?
Well, luckily, my name is different from both of yours. So I can be contacted on LinkedIn as Kathleen Jennings or through my email, which is kjj@wimlaw.com.
All right. And as always, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. This was a particularly joyful episode. First one with Thom Jr. Always love spending time with my kids. And of course, my favorite sister. And I have two. So when I say that, it's a little more meaning because you only have one brother. But anyhow,
he said that to his
but
other
you
sister
are
on the
still
last
my
podcast.
You are still my favorite brother.
That's right. All right. So again, please subscribe. Please share. Again, if you're looking for executive recruitment, of course, reach out to Thom Jr. If you're looking for labor and employment law trainings, because again, if you're looking for a labor and employment law training because something bad has happened, certainly you can reach out to Kathleen, but we would much rather have you get in touch with her before something happens. And once again, thank you so much for listening to Cover Your Assets. We'll see you next time.